Hi, I'm Sylvia Burgos Toffness, and this is Deep Roots Radio, the Face to Face edition. This show trains a spotlight on the connections between what we eat and how it's grown because every dollar you spend on food or clothing, lumber or healthcare products can either help or hurt the environment. What you buy promotes humane livestock management or perpetuates harmful conditions. Your purchases can also help farmers make a living wage or continually struggle to make ends meet. Every guest brings knowledge and experience and perspectives that illustrate the linkages between farming practice and health, the health of the land, livestock, we humans, and our economy. My guests come from all across the country and around the world. They describe efforts that point us to more vital and just systems. I hope you enjoy this interview. And I am so glad to have with me today Dr. Anne Stobart. She is a trained and highly experienced clinical herbalist, a designer and implementer of permaculture in the way of medicinal forests. She is host to hundreds of visitors and a teacher and a blogger. She also is the author of 3 books so far. Household Medicine in 17th Century England, that's one. The Medicinal Forest Garden Handbook, and her latest book, Trees and Shrubs That Heal. Very good. Well, I'm so glad to welcome Anne Stobart to our second installment in a 5-part series based on trees and shrubs that heal. So, Anne, how did you become familiar with the medicinal shrubs and trees in the United States?
So, I mean, it's great to be here and talking about my favourite subjects, medicinal trees. I if I think about it, I go back maybe 20 years or more, a bit more, to my training as a medical herbalist, and we had lots of North American plants included in that training. So I was kind of already geared up, even before starting to grow any of these trees, to thinking about medicinal plants, things like slippery elm, for example, Ulmus fulva or rubra, and black haw, viburnum prunifolium for women's complaints. So were already in the materia medica that I was being taught here. And it never occurred to me that there wasn't a place for these North American trees. And it was only after I'd qualified, trained, and started in practice that I started to realize that there was potential for actually growing some of these trees. So I got quite excited about the possibilities when I actually had a bit of land.
It's really quite interesting that you put it in that kind of perspective, because certainly in the last 6 years, as I've been increasing my studies of medicinal plants, very often the most elemental books fail to, well, I don't know if it's fail, but they don't mention that so many of these herbs actually come from foreign places outside of your immediate bioregion. And it led me to initially think that, oh, you can only use those things that come from other places. And I didn't realize how much can grow in your own region of the world. So it's kind of interesting that you've got that kind of perspective from your own education years ago.
There's certainly, the overlap is incredible. If you think back practically almost to the Middle Ages, there were spices being brought across overland out of Asia, fascination with the what would have been regarded as exotic plants that were really, really very expensive. Even things like rhubarb, the Chinese rhubarb was decidedly the best one to have. and it originally, I think it was imported through Russia. So there were some very interesting routes. And of course, it was with the explorers reaching what were regarded as new worlds, although they were already occupied. They didn't really take much notice of that, were sending back reports of these amazing plants, some of which I've looked at in my kind of herbal history research. And when we do a session about herbal history, I can talk more about the recipes and the tropical remedies that people really were seeking after. But yes, I agree. The two worlds, if you like, the New World, the Americas, and the European worlds became incredibly mingled by importing all these remedies and learning how to use them. And in some cases, some things were substituted, but not always. Sometimes it was the original species that had to be obtained.
Now, your knowledge, though, of the North American flora, that has not come just from your studies. You've actually been to the US, haven't you?
I was so lucky when I took retirement from my teaching post at Middlesex University in London, where I was running a program for professional herbal practitioners. I decided to treat myself. And at the time, the United Plant Savers, the organization in the States seeking to sort of replenish the herbal habitats and protect the plants at risk, they were offering I suppose you'd call it an intern placement or an internship of about 6 weeks. And I was able to come over to the States for 6 weeks, sort of September, October, back in 2010 it was, and to spend time at their flagship botanical sanctuary in Ohio near Athens, and learn all about these amazing trees.
So, when you take a look at those that you've studied and used in your clinical practice, and really have had as a focus in your book, Trees and Shrubs That Heal, that just came out, by the way, in January here in the United States of 2024, are there some that you'd like to focus on for this conversation?
Well, my hit list
I like the way you put that.
is actually, I mean, there are so many more. I don't know if people realize, but in the UK, we've only got about 40 native tree species, and you've got hundreds, all different kinds of oaks and all sorts of things. So there's plenty to choose from. But I sort of started to think about which are the ones that I could actually grow. And so I suppose in a way, those are the ones that I'm more familiar with and have become more my favorites. Some of them are already planted here as ornamentals. For example, black walnut, Juglans nigra. So it's a beautiful ornamental tree, and it is grown quite widely, particularly some of the smaller versions. Walnut gives us the husks around the nuts, the green husks, which are rich in tannins and other constituents, and is a very powerful laxative amongst other things. I also came to realize that there were some trees that were that are related to trees here, because of course at one time, if you go back millions of years, all of the continents were a bit connected up. For example, buckthorns. So the buckthorn in the States is Rhamnus persiana, the basis for Cascara sacrata, which is a worldwide commercial remedy used for laxative purposes. But here in the UK, we've got several buckthorns, Rhamnus cathartica and Rhamnus frangula, so purging buckthorn and alder buckthorn. And they do similar things. They've got bark which can be used as a laxative. In fact, Rhamnus cathartica is so powerful, you can tell it from the name, the Latin name, it's cathartic. And it's very important that the bark is dried for a year before it's used. And actually, it's probably not really something that's used nowadays. Traditionally, it might have been used with livestock, actually.
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah. So the Rhamnus frangula, or the alder buckthorn, which has been renamed Frangula ulmus, is one that does grow here. It's a native, and it can be used as quite an effective laxative, and it can be used as an alternative to Cascara sagrada, so that it takes pressure off the wild harvested populations, which may be
Mm.
more at risk.
That's something that we're going to be getting into in a future conversation, that whole notion of over harvesting or the diminishing supplies of some of these very, very useful plants through pressure of different kinds, whether it's environmental, animal, industrial, or whatever. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation as well. Another one that was on your list is witch hazel. Another one on your top 10 list looks like witch hazel.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked about witch hazel. It's such a beautiful, wonderful plant. And it's a really interesting plant because it offers a certain amount of astringency. It's very widely used for first aid purposes. It occurs in cold creams and eye drops and so
Hmm.
many things. So it tends to be used more externally um, for its astringent and anti-inflammatory effects. And of course, the world supply started really in the States with Dickinson's, the firm that produce the majority probably of distilled witch hazel, although I understand there are organic growers and suppliers. And when I came over to the States and for my intern placement with the United Plant Savers, I loved that I was staying in a converted barn, and I could hear the seed pods of witch hazel popping, and because they stay on the tree for a whole year, and then they burst and eject their seed quite a distance away, and I could hear them popping and rolling down, the seeds rolling down the roof of the metal roof of the barn, which was
No
wonderful.
kidding. That's
And it
that's
was
quite an experience.
so this is Virginian witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana, and most people in the in Britain or Europe are familiar with witch hazel because of the yellow strap-like flowers as an ornamental. And they're also familiar with the idea that witch hazel flowers early in the year. But in fact, that isn't the American witch hazel, that's a Asian or Chinese witch hazel, which is often grafted onto a rootstock, which is the American witch hazel. So things get very complicated. And of course, the grafted plants are very expensive here. So quite early on in the period when I had land where I could plant trees, I was really interested in the possibility of growing American witch hazel and then harvesting it for distillation. Of course, there are several parts of the witch hazel that are used. At Dickinson's, I think they harvest the whole tree from the undergrowth of oak forests, and there may be some issues now about the wild populations that are available. Whereas here in the UK, I took a slightly different approach and harvested the leafy twigs and produced a wonderful floral distillate from
Hmm.
those.
I've got some witch hazel that I planted, and I'm quite excited. I planted these last year, so I'm quite excited to see them grow and thrive. But I'm thinking that they might be a favorite of the local deer population. And so when it comes to designing the medicinal forest garden, there will be some questions I have for you in our future episode about how to best cultivate it and protect it from wildlife. Now you've got on your top list one that I find is growing quite well here that I've planted, and that is cramp bark. Why is that on your favorite list as well?
So I mentioned black haw as part of my training as a herbalist, and regarded as a really quite important herb for women's complaints, particularly the bark. And blackhaw, Viburnum prunifolium, is quite closely related to what most people in the States, I think, would call the European high bush cranberry, or a version of Viburnum opulus. But here in the UK, we regard cramp bark as, we call it the Guelder rose or the snowball tree. And it's often regarded, because it's got big, like white pom-pom flowers in
Mhm.
certain varieties, it's often regarded as an ornamental. But it does have the similar bark, an antispasmodic bark, and it's really useful for the things like period pains, menstrual cramps, muscle spasm, not just uterine muscle spasm, but also other um, muscular spasms, so colicky pains and muscular aches. So this is such a useful plant, and it grows like the clappers in the UK. It quite likes a moist and slightly acidic situation. And
Mm.
I understand that blackhaw, Viburnum prunifolium, is at risk in the USA. I think I think it might even be endangered in some states, like Connecticut. And so it's quite important to be thinking about substitution and what alternatives we can effectively use. Because it grows so well, it can even be coppiced, the Viburnum opulus, the Guelder rose, and that's what I have been doing here in the UK.
Can you give a tiny little explanation of what it means to coppice
Mm.
a tree or shrub?
For sure, yeah. So there are some uh, shrubs and small trees, particularly, are good, that can be cut to the ground and they will resprout from a stump. And that's coppicing. Pollarding is cutting to a higher level usually. And in Europe, there's a long tradition of coppicing, particularly for plants like hazel, which is used quite widely for fencing and making all sorts of things. Other trees traditionally were coppiced to produce particular shapes and sizes of timber for different requirements. So
Oh,
it's probably something that's not done much more here. And there are a few people who are trying to restore coppiced woodlands, which is great, because coppiced woodlands, because they're frequently cut back, they have a wonderful range of plants growing in the undergrowth.
it is amazing how much you can get of usable material when something is coppiced, because very often, well, since you've cut everything to the ground, what grows, uh, for me anyway, it's much more within my reach, and I can grab those smaller twigs in order to harvest the barks without having to either climb up on a huge ladder or hurt the major tree. And I'm doing that with a cherry
Mm.
that was coppiced unintentionally. We were trying to get rid of it unintentionally about 3 years ago, and is now put out several trees from that root that I can harvest in a more sustainable fashion. So that was an accidental learning of it, of a very, very important technique. Now, you were talking about a little bit about the over harvesting, or the fact that black haw has become kind of less available and sometimes even endangered in certain parts of the United States. Do you know why it has become so dear?
So, with regards to black haw, I'm not that sure, but I suspect that it's to do with the natural environment being reduced, so that there's more agriculture, there's more clearance, and there's less management of woodlands in a way that encourages these more traditional plants. I mean, a
Mm,
great example of over harvesting is of ginseng and golden seal, which are
right.
woodland plants in their own right. They rely on or grow best in the forests. So it's quite likely that black haws suffering a similar fate.
Now, you've mentioned ginseng and golden seal as being those that have been over harvested, and their environments very often changed so drastically that they no longer have that natural place in which to grow. Yeah, another one that you've got on your preferred list too, when you think about the things that you've encountered in the U.S., is slippery elm, which kind of falls within the same um, endangered spot.
Yeah. So it's a sad thing that elms are so much undermined, and it's particularly disease in the case of the slippery elm. Uh, what it means is that if land is well managed, then trees that are affected by the slippery elm disease, disease, can actually be identified before they're completely ruined, and they can be felled before they're unusable, and their bark can still be used. But it is a major problem, so that the supply of slippery elm is not guaranteed in the long run. We have to start thinking about alternatives. And there are some alternatives. For example, marshmallow root as a powder is another lovely demulcent, because of course that's what slippery elm really offers. It offers a wonderful kind of gloopy mixture which can help to protect um, the mucosa of the lining of the gut.
Mm-hmm.
So marshmallow seed is another one. And I discovered when I started researching trees that there's another one that I hadn't realized, which is the quince, which is in the rose family. It has seeds which can be powdered and used in a similar way as a demulcent. And there's not much
Mm.
use for quince seed in other ways. So that was quite a good one to find. It's one of the ones that I write up in my book, Trees and Shrubs That Heal.
Now, you talked about golden seal. You mentioned that briefly just a few minutes ago. What is it about golden seal that made it so sought after?
Yeah, it's a magical plant. It's a slow growing plant, very low, and so it's the roots of golden seal, which are quite yellow in colour. So they're very rich in berberine, and berberine offers quite an incredible level of activity in the body. So golden seal is particularly known for its antibiotic effects,
Mm.
and it's also quite helpful for, again, for the mucosal linings of the body. So it's used in quite a lot of complaints, and the value has shot up considerably. So it is now protected under the CITES protection, which stops golden seal from being exported, the root from being exported
Mm.
without a license.
Wow.
Fortunately, fortunately, there are now woodland owners who are realizing the value of golden seal and beginning to replant it, so that there is a much more sustainable harvest that is possible. And the United Plant Savers are active in encouraging people and providing lots of education for woodland owners so that they can do this.
Is it hard to try to cultivate golden seal?
No, it's slow because it takes quite a few years to reach for roots to reach a useful size, and they do require a fairly specific environment, quite
Mm.
moist, rich in humus, shady, and so on. But it can be done. There are people growing golden seal under sort of shade covers here in the UK as well.
So, seeing that it currently is in a hazardous spot from having been over harvested, or its environmental conditions changed, is are there substitutes for golden seal?
Well, there are there certainly are berberine containing plants. One of them is people would mostly know it as Mahonia or Oregon grape.
Right.
And if you scrape the it's now been renamed, another one that's been renamed Berberis aquifolium, so it's related to the barberry. But if you
Mm.
scrape a little of the bark or the root of Mahonia, you find that it's bright yellow. So we have another plant with
Mm.
a rich amount of berberine. And although the roots are traditionally what's used, it's also possible to use the bark of the plant. And the
Ah,
great thing about Oregon grape is that it grows well in the shade. So it's a good woodland plant. Used a lot here as an ornamental because it has these beautiful yellow flowers that are loved by bees very early. It's flowering, has been flowering here right now, early spring flowers.
well, I'll be dipping my feet into that water this spring. I've got two Oregon grape plants that are in gallon pots growing in the house, and they'll be moved out into our woody area. So I'll be looking for your books. I'll tell you, and uh, not only your newest book, but your other book on how to design your forest garden. So these are very useful resources for me. Another one that you mentioned is ginseng as one that is that had been over harvested really, really dramatically. Um, is that one that you find that you find popular for yourself, or are there some substitutes for it?
So ginseng is an adaptogen, so it has a general effect of increasing stamina and improving many body functions. So helping immunity and alertness and so on. There's loads of research to support both American ginseng and also the Asian ginsengs. Although interestingly, American ginseng is very popular in Asia, which has been another pressure on it.
Mm.
So it, 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 it's difficult to replace it directly in the sense
Ah,
of identical constituents, but there are so many other plants, particularly ones that perhaps would be regarded as functional foods, the fruits of many plants like goji berries and other kinds of cherries and all sorts of fruits that are all really beneficial in supporting body systems, including circulation and so on. But there are lots of other ways to promote health, and we do. It is important that we are looking at those alternatives, given that they're so much easier to grow. They can be grown, as I was talking about, coppice management, so they can be grown in much more sustainable ways, not necessarily having to rely on wild sources.
right. I guess as we're kind of getting close to the end of our time at this in this episode, I'm wondering, people might be listening to us and might be thinking, well, here I am living in North America, and I don't have room for a huge tree where I am. Is there a minimum size that people have to have available to them in order to begin to grow some medicinal shrubs or trees?
Um, no. In fact, I think it's fair to say that you can grow an awful lot in quite a small space. In the UK, we have allotments, and the standard size of an allotment is 10 meters by 30 meters. And so that's 300 square meters. And I've got an allotment and I grow lots and lots of fruit and herbs and so on. I don't really grow so many trees, but more shrubs and the like. And there are plenty of back gardens which are perhaps even smaller, perhaps half that size. Our garden is about a half the size of an allotment. And I think I've got one, two, three, a good half a dozen trees that are kept fairly well pruned, producing fruit and herbs ranging through ginkgo and pears and lots of mulberries and so on. So there's quite a range of possibilities that can be grown up walls, can be grown in pots, can be kept cut back as coppice plants.
Mm.
So what I would say is that don't feel that you have to don't feel that you have to miss out on trees and shrubs just because the space is limited. But with a bit of planning, which hopefully we will talk about in a future session, it's possible to get quite a few different plants in. I do try to talk a bit about this design approach in one of the courses that I run online, which is a Medicinal Forest Garden Design course. So that might be something to look at. And you mentioned earlier the Medicinal Forest Garden Handbook, where I talk about principles of design. So those might be helpers in thinking about how to fit lots of different plants in.
Well, you've got your books and you've got your online courses, which I've taken and I've really, really found very useful. So thank you to that and to Zoom for making that available worldwide. You also put out a newsletter, don't you? And how would people find that?
So just recently, I've tried my hand at a little bit more, extending myself. I've got masses of material and information that I want to share. So, as the medicinal tree woman, I've launched a newsletter on Substack, started at the end of 2023. There are both free and paid subscription levels, and I'm hoping to pass on a whole lot more information and perhaps build up more of a community around the ideas of medicinal forest gardening so that we can be using all the space, if you like, a 3D approach to
Ah.
growing medicinal herbs, not just herbs on the ground, but looking up and seeing what's possible.
Well, as we wrap up here, Anne, are there any final thoughts, I guess, that you'd like the listener or the viewer to hear when they think about medicinal trees and shrubs in North America?
I think you're just so lucky. You're so lucky in North America. You've got such wonderful plants, ranging from desert and prairie through to mountains and really cold places. I just recently put out on the Medicinal Tree Woman newsletter a post about Juneberry, which you may know as Saskatoon or the Amelanchier family of trees. And they seem to be able to survive in so many different places, up mountainsides, very cold places, and perhaps some warm and dry areas. And the fruit is fantastic. But sometimes people may not realize you can also use the leaves. The leaves can be harvested for making tea, an infusion in hot water. So I suppose what I would say is we don't have to stick with what we already know. We can extend our knowledge by a little bit of experimentation and trying things out. There's always more to learn. And as I say before, I think the range of plants, the biodiversity in the States is really something to be admired.
I'm so glad we can look forward to a series of conversations with Anne over the next several months. She'll be looking at the trees and shrubs of North America as well as those of England. We'll also talk about plants that are at risk, either because of overharvesting or because of environmental changes. She'll talk about how to use these plants safely. That's something all of us have to consider. And she'll take a look at the history of using these wonderful plants over the centuries. Please go to my YouTube channel for additional show notes and for a link to Anne's newsletter. Also be on the lookout for her books, the Medicinal Forest Garden Handbook, Trees and Shrubs That Heal, and Household Medicine in 17th Century England. Until next time, discover the amazing world of healthful plants wherever you live.